today's show is now in order. I'm not saying that I have inside information on who the president's going to pick or anything like that. I'm not saying anything like that. I'll give you all the updates on the news, and we'll go through what this means that Justice Anthony Kennedy, who, as I have said many times on this program, made up his mind on how to vote based on whether he had his Metamucil that morning, he's going to step down. I'll explain everything that means. Oh, yesterday, after we finished this podcast, Anthony Kennedy stepped down and blew up the world. So I was not expecting Justice Anthony Kennedy to step down from his position on the Supreme Court. And the fact is that I think most people were hit by a truck over this. Like, most people in the Trump administration were very surprised by this. And maybe President Trump was not, because maybe he'd be having discussions with Justice Kennedy. But there are a lot of people who were very surprised by Justice Kennedy stepping down, specifically because most of his legacy is going to be the gay rights stuff, right? He was the lead writer in Obergefell, which was the case that suggested that same-sex marriage had to be the law of the land. He was socially liberal on issues like abortion. But he stepped down while Trump was president and there was a Republican Congress. And that cut against a lot of the conventional wisdom. I, for example, thought that he was going to stick it out until there was a Democrat who was president so that his legacy would be maintained. Instead, he decided to step down. The reason I think he decided to step down, besides the fact that he's 81 years old, is because I think that he looked at the spate of rulings that the Supreme Court has issued over the last 3 weeks. And what he saw was that there were 4 votes to overturn a lot of First Amendment protections. And there have been 3 major cases in the last couple of weeks in which 5-4, the Supreme Court had decided in favor of free speech. But if he were to be replaced by somebody from the left, then the left would immediately curtail the right to free speech. So, for example, there was a case that I discussed at length yesterday on the podcast, this case in which the Supreme Court decided that you could not be forced to pay into a union for which you did not vote. And Anthony Kennedy was on the majority side of that opinion. He said that that was a violation of the First Amendment. Well, there were 4 votes to say that the government can force you to pay money to an association like a union that you don't want to pay into. Right? Anthony Kennedy probably looked at that and he said, I'm not sure that I want to leave when a Democrat's in office, because then there will be 5 votes in favor of the proposition that the government can force you to pay money to an association that you don't like. And then there was a case that came down in the last couple of weeks in which, for example, it said that the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, where it said that if you are a religious baker, you do not have to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding, but only, this was decided on narrow grounds, only because the regulation in question was badly promulgated by the Colorado Civil Rights Commission. There were 4 votes in that case to basically suggest that any religious baker in the country can be forced at point of government gun to cater a same-sex wedding. And Anthony Kennedy, even though he's a gay rights advocate, might not be the kind of guy who wants the government to force people to do what they don't want to do at point of gun. And so he figured, okay, if I step down when a Democrat is president, then there will be 5 votes for the proposition that the government can force any religious person in the country to violate his or her prescriptions when it comes to business. So I think Anthony Kennedy looked at the radical left of the court and he said, I don't want my legacy to be the radical left of the court. I'd rather that my legacy be the gay rights legacy. My guess is that he went to Chief Justice Roberts and he got a guarantee from him that Roberts would become the new swing vote if same-sex marriage were to come back up for reconsideration, and Roberts will work to tamp that down. That the same-sex marriage stuff will stay enshrined in law, and his legacy will be enshrined, and he'll be fine. And he will be able to step down from the court and be replaced by somebody who is more in line with his thinking on First Amendment issues. Now, all of that is speculation, but that is my strong inclination, is that that's what happened here. In any case, the Kennedy steps down, and that, of course, opens up a slot on the Supreme Court and a swing vote on the Supreme Court, because Kennedy has been the swing vote. Kennedy has been the guy who makes the decisions in these 5-4 cases. He's been the most powerful guy in the country for a long time. And that is a testament to the fact that the Supreme Court has become far too powerful in American life. You saw an enormous amount of gnashing of teeth and wailing and rending of garments from the left and tremendous excitement from the right at the fact that this seat is now open on the Supreme Court and Trump is going to get to fill it. And the reason for that is that the Supreme Court has become entirely too powerful in the structure of American government. If you go back and you look at the Federalist Papers, and we go through them every week here on the Ben Shapiro Show, when you go back and you look through the Federalist Papers, what you see is that they thought that the judiciary was going to be a relatively powerless arm of the government, that its job was basically going to be to sit there and say this is constitutional and this is not, but not on the grounds that they don't like a piece of legislation. In fact, the federal constitution didn't even apply to the states. So the federal courts, and the Supreme Court in particular, were supposed to be relatively toothless. Now the Supreme Court gets to decide whether everyone in the country is able to obtain an abortion, is able to kill babies. The Supreme Court gets to decide whether anyone in the country is able to get married to anybody else. The Supreme Court has entirely too much power, and that is reflected in all of the focus on the Supreme Court. That's because the left has taken the Supreme Court and used it as a tool in order to promulgate its agenda. The left sees the Supreme Court as its chief tool in pushing legislation it can't get passed through popular means. The reality is the left was pushing same-sex marriage, for example, for years and years, and they weren't getting any place with regard to federal legislation. So they went to the courts, and the courts gave them what they wanted. And the same thing was true on abortion. Well, because you rely on the courts, when the courts flip to the other side, there's now a lot of power in the hands of the right. And we'll talk about what that means and what the courts should be doing in just 1 second. First, I want to point out that, some of us have been dreaming of being on the Supreme Court our entire lives. So, Mr. President, if you're listening to this, I would just remind you that when 12-year-old Ben Shapiro was playing at the Israeli Bonds banquet in 1996, Larry King talked specifically about the dreams of that young man.
Shapiro is 12 years old. He'll be accompanied by his father, David. He began training on the violin at age 5. In addition to the violin, he plays chess, loves baseball, completes in track and field. His goal is to become the first Orthodox rabbi to sit on the Supreme Court. Meaning of court will have to close at 3 o'clock on Friday.
So I'm not saying that it's something that I would take. I'm not saying it's a job that if it were offered to me, I would take. I'm not saying that both Ann Coulter and David Limbaugh said in 2005, when I was still at Harvard Law School, I should be on the Supreme Court. I'm not saying that I'm 34 years old and I'd be on the Supreme Court for the next 60 years, Mr. President. But if you chose to make that pick, would I turn it down? I don't know. I mean, it's not like I don't know. I'm not that enthusiastic about it. I mean, but okay. In any case, Mitch McConnell says that the vote is going to come this fall. That this fall there will be a vote on President Trump's replacement justice, and you can just see the glee on Cocaine Mitch's face. So Mitch McConnell has snorted a full line, and then he went into Capitol Hill, and this is what Mitch McConnell sounds like when he's very, very excited about something.
The Senate stands ready to fulfill its constitutional role by offering advice and consent on President Trump's nominee to fill this vacancy. We will vote to confirm Justice Kennedy's successor this fall.
Okay, that is amped up Mitch McConnell right there. That is Mitch McConnell on an 11 on a skeleton. He's got that spinal tap. He got that spinal tap volume turned all the way to the top. And look, Mitch McConnell deserves a lot of credit for this because it was Mitch McConnell who said, I am not going to move forward on the nomination of Merrick Garland. And he stood strong in the face of a lot of press attacks. And it's Mitch McConnell who is largely responsible for the fact that there will be 2 picks for the president of the United States. President Trump says he is going to pick from the current list, which makes a lot of sense. He has a list of 25 possibilities. There are top 5 that I'm going to explain in just a few minutes here. I'm going to go through the people who are being looked at with the most scrutiny, according to Fred Barnes over at the Weekly Standard. We'll talk about how a justice should be selected. But here's President Trump saying that he's going to pick from the current list. Unfortunately, there are those of us who are not on the list. But President Trump says that he will pick from the list that he's got already.
Who will you pick to replace him, sir?
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Well, we have obviously numerous people. We have a list of 25 people that I actually had during my election. I had to 20, and as you know, I added 5 a little while ago.
And President Trump also said last night, he had a big rally last night, and he said that he was honored that Kennedy chose to step down on his watch.
And I'm very honored that he chose to do it during my term in office because he felt confident in me to make the right choice and carry on his great legacy. That's why he did it.
Okay, one of the things that's amazing about President Trump, you really have to admire, the man has the devil's luck. I mean, there is just no question that he has incredible luck. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't have skill. I mean, the president is very skilled at a good many things, but he's also damned lucky. I mean, the fact is that George W. Bush, in his entire 8-year term in office, got to replace 2 justices. President Obama, in his entire 8-year term in office, got to replace 2 justices, neither of them swing justices. President Trump gets to replace 2 justices in the first year and a half of his term. Right? That's an amazing, amazing thing. And one of those is Justice Kennedy, who's a swing justice. Now, President Trump was lucky enough to have Jeb Bush to beat up on in the primaries and then get $2 billion of free media coverage. He was lucky enough to run against the worst candidate in American history, who was under full FBI investigation. And a week before the election, it was revealed that she was under renewed FBI investigation. President Trump was lucky enough to be there when Kim Jong-un accidentally blew up his own nuclear mountain. And now he is lucky enough to be there when Justice Anthony Kennedy steps down. So, you know, Lefty Gomez, famous New York Yankees pitcher, once said, it's better to be lucky than good. It's better to be both lucky and good. President Trump is definitely lucky, and he certainly has the opportunity to be quite good here. Now, how should justices be selected? Right? How should we determine which justices should be selected? Because the fact is, Republicans have blown opportunity after opportunity on the Supreme Court. Right? I may be the only conservative in America who came out against the nomination of Judge Roberts for Chief Justice Roberts way back when. Way back in 2005, when Bush nominated Roberts, I opposed Roberts because I said the man did not have a long track record of textualism and originalism, and he wasn't on record supporting strong textualist positions when it came to controversial cases. And anybody who is not openly conservative, and I don't mean conservative in the sense that they're politically conservative, anybody who is not textualist or originalist, which I'll... So, when it comes to selection of justices, here's what you need. You need an open and obvious commitment to originalism and textualism. Originalism and textualism are the basic notion that when you read a text, when you read the Constitution of the United States, you're not reading poetry. It is not a living document where you get to reinterpret the provisions as you see fit that day. That's not what the Constitution was for. And you wouldn't interpret any other piece of legislation that way. You wouldn't take the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1907 and take that piece of legislation and then say, you know what? I think the Sherman Antitrust Act means that gay marriage is now legal, because the document evolves. Okay, that's not how documents work. The whole point of writing something down in a document, the whole point of legislation is that it is a piece of law promulgated at a particular time with a particular meaning in a particular place. And if you want to change that meaning, then you can always pass another piece of legislation. You can have a constitutional amendment, for example. This is why the Constitution has so many amendments, because it needed to be changed in many ways. And the fact is that the Constitution of the United States does not explicitly prohibit, for example, women from voting. But the Supreme Court didn't just go back and reinterpret the Constitution and say the Constitution now means women can vote. There was a constitutional amendment that had to be passed in order so that women could vote, because that's how legislation works. The way legislation works is that it is the legislature that should be doing the legislating. It is the job of judges to look at the text, see what it means, not what they wish it meant, not what they hope it meant, not what they would like it to mean, but what it actually meant at the time that it was written, and then they implement that text. And again, if you want to change that text, well, that's why you have a legislature. That's why you have an elected branch of government. The left doesn't believe in this. The left believes that reading a text as it is meant to be read is instead an exercise in conservatism. It's an exercise in judicial activism to read the Constitution as it was written. Now, if that sounds backwards to you, it's because it is. It's stupid. It's the idea there should be an oligarchy that rules us from above and gets to determine what everything means in their own heads. So the latest example of that, I mean, the Obergefell decision that Kennedy decided is a great case of this, where Kennedy looked at the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which was about preventing discrimination against black people, and said the 14th Amendment to the Constitution mandates that a man can marry a man all across the country. Now, maybe you believe that a man should be able to marry a man. That's your prerogative. Vote for a legislature that says it's fine. That's fine. But to the idea that a judge is going to determine that from a document that was written in 1789, right, and a Bill of Rights that was promulgated in 1791, and you're going to take that document and reinterpret it to mean whatever you think it ought to mean, that is a fundamental breach of judicial duty. And that's why when we look at the judges, what we should be looking at is who is going to implement the Constitution as written. That's their job. What conservatives want is for the judiciary, the Supreme Court, to bring back its focus to what it was supposed to do. For the Supreme Court to be just as constrained as it originally was. What the left wants the Supreme Court to do is implement leftist values. Okay, so how does this play out? Well, let's talk about some of the potential nominees that President Trump is considering. So according to Fred Barnes over at the Weekly Standard, the White House has now narrowed down its list of potential Supreme Court nominees to a top 5. Brett Kavanaugh, who's 53 on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, Amul Thapar, who is 49 on the 6th Circuit, Amy Barrett, who's 46 on the 7th Circuit, Thomas Hardiman, 52 on the 3rd Circuit, and Raymond Kethledge, 51 on the 6th Circuit. So all of these folks are relatively young. You figure that all of them will spend probably 30 years on the court, barring serious health problems. This is why the idea that Trump gets to shape the court for a full generation here is exactly right. Now, all of that assumes, of course, that Chief Justice Roberts isn't going to become a Kennedy-like swing vote, which I think is a dubious assumption, but it's possible that you may actually have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court for the first time in legitimately generations. So here is what we know about the people who are being discussed. Brett Kavanaugh is apparently the front runner. He is also the person who is the most icy. Okay, so I do not think the president should select Brett Kavanaugh of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. He's a former clerk for Justice Kennedy. He was elevated to the federal bench in 2006 after a 3-year delay. The reason his nomination was delayed was because Democrats were upset over the fact that Kavanaugh used to work for Ken Starr in the office of the Solicitor General, and he had the temerity to say that the Clinton administration targeted Ken Starr. So Kavanaugh has been on the court for quite a while. He has a long record. He's authored about 300 decisions. He recently dissented when the circuit decided that a 17-year-old illegal immigrant detainee had a right to an abortion. He said that the decision was, quote, based on a constitutional principle as novel as it is wrong. He held in 2011 that the Washington, D.C. ban on semi-automatic rifles and its gun registration requirement were unconstitutional under the Supreme Court's Heller decision, which recognized that the Second Amendment to the Constitution was an individual right. All of these are good decisions. He also held that the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau structure was unconstitutional, which of course is true as well, and holds administrative decision-making to a minimum. Okay, Kavanaugh, here's where it starts to get a little bit dicey. Kavanaugh, like Chief Justice Roberts, is known for working across the aisle. He is, on the downside, apparently, a general believer in Chevron deference. Chevron deference is the idea that you have these administrative courts, these administrative law courts, that get to decide your fate, and you can't appeal that directly to the judiciary. So administrative law courts exist in the executive branch. There's a whole branch of thought that says Chevron deference is stupid. That if something is decided by, for example, the EPA, that is reviewable by a judge because the EPA is not a judicial system. The EPA is a regulatory system. Kavanaugh reportedly does not use textualist methods nearly as much as conservatives might wish. And worst, he upheld Obamacare in Sissel versus Department of Health and Human Services, as well as Seven Sky versus Holder, in which he may have actually crafted the rationale that Chief Justice Roberts eventually used in calling the Obamacare penalties a tax. Remember that Chief Justice Roberts rewrote Obamacare to make it constitutional, suggesting that it was a tax rather than a penalty. And it appears that Kavanaugh may have actually created that rationale. So I'm not saying that Kavanaugh would certainly be another Chief Justice Roberts, but I think it's more likely he would be another Roberts than another Gorsuch. Okay, now Amul Thapar, he's relatively new to the appellate courts. He voted to uphold Ohio's method of lethal injection, and a Michigan government's meetings opening with the Christian prayer. He said that's legal as well. He's ruled that monetary donations are a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. Now, because Thapar's record is relatively thin on the Court of Appeals, he was only appointed in the last year and a half, there's not much to go on with regard to issues like abortion and religious freedom. With that said, Professor Brian Fitzpatrick of Vanderbilt Law School described Thapar as very Scalia-like and very Thomas-like, and Thapar has criticized Richard Posner's pragmatism. Posner is on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals and is a terrible judge. He criticized Posner's pragmatism in judicial theory because using pragmatism rather than text would, quote, elevate judges to the position of co-legislator, which is exactly right. Judges should not be legislating. They should be interpreting the law as it is written. He is a textualist who has praised Scalia himself. So if I have to choose between Thapar and Kavanaugh, I choose Thapar. The best of the bunch, it seems to me, is Amy Barrett. So Amy Barrett is on the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. She was a cause celeb, you recall, when Democrats began suggesting that her Catholicism was a bar to her ability to be an objective judge. And she was supposedly so Catholic that she was going to use her Catholicism to rule in particular cases. She says that life begins at conception. She signed a letter from the Beckett Fund criticizing Obamacare's requirement that employers provide contraceptive coverage, calling it a, quote, grave violation of religious freedom. Barrett has written in depth on Justice Scalia's originalism. She's evidenced support for textualism as well. She clerked for Scalia. So Amy Barrett would just be first rate. She's the youngest of the bunch. She's a woman, and it would drive Democrats up a wall because she's Catholic as well. So I think Amy Barrett is my number one choice.